Well, Jeffrey Ball is the scholar in residence at Stanford University's Steyer Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance and a lecturer at Stanford Law School, one of the great writers on energy policy. So, Jeffrey, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Brock, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's so great to have you on. During COP26, I saw the study that your group put together called Hot Money, Illuminating the Finance of High Carbon Infrastructure in the Developing World. And, during COP26, but all the time, we're thinking about how we decarbonize, right? How we electrify everything, how we decarbonize. And it's kind of baffling to think that there is still fossil fuel infrastructure that is being built anywhere. So I know obviously you and your group were focused on what is happening in the developing world. So what was the point of this study? What were the questions that you were wanting to answer?
Well, I guess there are sort of two groups of questions. One is the one that you posed just a moment ago, which is if renewable energy has gotten so cheap, and indeed, compared to where it was 5 or 10 years ago, it has. Why isn't everyone doing just renewable energy? And the answer is lots of people are not doing renewable energy, and we can come back to the reasons for that, but we wanted to understand why that is the case. And specifically, we want to understand why that's the case in the geographies in the world that matter most. And that is not California, where I am, and it's not Indiana, where you are, and it's not the United States writ large. It's not the developed world writ large, it's the developing world, emerging and developing economies, the places around the world, particularly in Asia, although not limited to Asia, where energy consumption and therefore carbon emissions are rising the fastest, where if the world does not bend that curve, as the wonks say, then the climate game is effectively over. And so the question is, what is happening in the developing world, and can it be changed? And more specifically, what's happening with the big stuff that's being built there, the heavy metal, as it were, the infrastructure in the developing world, because it's developing, it's the infrastructure, projects like power plants and roads and ports and airports, those things that are being built now that are going to be around for decades that will set the trajectories of carbon emissions in these places for decades to come. If high carbon infrastructure is built now, it's very, very difficult to see how we're going to meet climate targets. If low carbon infrastructure is built now, we have a much better chance. And then the last thing I would say is, so we start with the developing world, and then we go to infrastructure in the developing world. And the real issue at the end of the day is money. It's finance. And so what we sought to do is to follow the flows of money, financing infrastructure, climate relevant infrastructure in emerging and developing economies. And I will just say that there is already a large literature of work trying to understand what is happening in the developing world with regard to the financing of infrastructure. We did not discover by any means the importance of this question. It occurred to us as we looked around that there was a lot of really good work on specific aspects of this question, but that we might be able to bring to bear data that we thought is both broader and deeper than had been available before to answer this question in a kind of more both granular and comprehensive way. And that's what we set out to do.
Coal gets so many of the headlines because of how dirty it is, how high the carbon emissions are, but that doesn't tell the whole story. And I thought it was really interesting in the study how much you talk about the building out of natural gas infrastructure throughout the developing world. We certainly see that in the United States. So what is happening?
Yeah, so I want to offer a disclaimer here to your listeners and your viewers. We're going to wonk out for a minute, but I promise we'll come back from the wonky weeds. Anyone who's been paying attention to climate change, as I know you have, and a lot of the people listening and watching this will have heard, as you say, about the focus on coal. Coal is pretty clearly the dirtiest of all fossil fuels. And there has been a huge push by the environmental community to try to stop the construction of new coal-fired power plants, and also indeed to close down coal-fired power plants that exist. And what's interesting recently is that there have been lots and lots of promises by governments, including the Biden administration in the United States, that it is going to stop financing the construction of coal-fired power plants in the developing world. So one would think that that is a huge win for the climate. And indeed, if that were to happen, emissions, the increase in emissions might, well, clearly would mitigate somewhat. But what we found is that even if you phased out coal tomorrow, you actually would not win this battle of bending the climate curve in the developing world, because as financing for coal is declining, what's ramping up quite a lot is the financing of power plants powered by natural gas. Now, natural gas, for every unit of electricity it produces, tends to emit about half as much carbon dioxide as coal does. So that's a lot cleaner. There are lots of caveats to that, owing to potential leaks in the natural gas system, which, depending on how they play out, could significantly increase emissions from gas. But let's just leave that aside for a moment. What we found is that if you add up all of the emissions, projected emissions from natural gas power plants that were built in developing countries in our database in the 3 years we looked at, which was 2018, 2019, and 2020, those natural gas-fired power plants will emit about 80% of the amount of carbon plants built in developing countries in those 3 years will. So the problem is not just coal. The problem is increasingly natural gas. And if those gas plants were built in such a way that they captured their carbon emissions and shot them underground for safekeeping, a technology called carbon capture and storage, which I know you've talked about on your podcast before, if those plants were equipped with that, then perhaps that wouldn't be an environmental problem. But basically, all those plants are not equipped with that. And so, as you said at the outset, what we found is that gas is a huge problem. And I think it's probably really unrealistic to think that countries that built those gas-fired power plants in the last 3 years are suddenly going to decide to shut them down. They're going to be using them. And so the question is, how can they be used in a way that is least problematic for the climate? And that's a whole other area of research that we plan to undertake, and that is, I think, really, really important. But simply focusing on coal misses a lot of the story here.
So let's talk about the money. Where is the money coming from for these projects?
Well, so yeah, the money for these projects is coming from major financing institutions all around the world. And just to step back a second, what we wanted to do, as I said at the outset, is follow the money. And what you see is that major banks, but not just banks, all kinds of other financing institutions all around the world are financing infrastructure in the developing world. And what we wanted to do, and what we're now able to do with this database that we built, and we can talk if it's interesting about how we put this together, but the data set that we have looks at power plants. It actually looks at infrastructure projects of all sorts around the world. But in the first tranche of work that we did, we looked just at power plants. This database is based on projects. So for a given power plant in a given country, this data set will tell you which institutions are investing, how much they're investing, how the financing institutions are allied with one another, what the structures of financing that they're using are. And this sounds all very in the weeds, but it's all really crucial to understanding what the incentives are to the financial backers of a particular project. And if you want to understand how to angle money away from high carbon infrastructure and toward low carbon infrastructure, you absolutely need to understand what the financial incentives are for institutions that are backing high carbon infrastructure, what the financial incentives are for institutions backing low carbon infrastructure, and how to shift those incentives from the high carbon stuff to the low carbon stuff. So maybe I'll just mention one thing that surprised us that we found in this work, which was there's been, as I said, there's been a lot of work looking at this question of why, of how to reduce the carbon intensity of infrastructure in the developing world. A lot of it, as I said a moment ago, has looked at how to reduce financing for coal. And as I said, we found that gas is particularly important. A lot of that this work also has looked at the role of overseas financial institutions. That is, let's say a Chinese bank or a Japanese bank or a South Korean bank or an American bank funding a power plant in Vietnam or Indonesia or Brazil. What we found is that overseas financing is indeed quite important, but what's also really important and increasingly important is the money coming domestically from Vietnam or Indonesia or Brazil. And in fact, we found nearly half the financing for these power plants, these misaligned power plants that are misaligned with climate goals. They are too carbon intensive to meet climate goals. Nearly half that financing is coming from institutions within the countries themselves. That's important because if you want to shift the money from the high carbon stuff to the low carbon stuff, and if a lot of that money for the high carbon stuff is originating not in Washington or Seoul or Tokyo or Beijing, but it's initiated in the countries themselves, that gives you a new lever and suggests to you that you ought to think about how do you change the incentives and the power dynamics in the countries in which the infrastructure is being built itself, in those political economies. It gives you a new playing field.
Sure. But I also think about it, and this is obviously a huge part of what it's talked about in COP26 is the financing for adaptation and mitigation that is owed to developing countries. I mean, this is an agreement, you've been covering COPs for a long time. We had that agreement and I believe it was in 2009 that there was going to be $100 billion a year in adaptation and mitigation financing, and it hasn't been delivered on. I think it's going to be 2023 before that $100 billion even delivered in full. And even that is not what the IPCC has as the actual amount it would take to hit mitigation goals, just mitigation goals, let alone, right? And so I wonder if that is impacting the way that, where the money is not, right? Because it's obviously, if there are no incentives tied to mitigation, how can we expect developing countries to make decisions when, promises haven't even been delivered on?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting question. And I think, the punchline is that there are so many zeros in all these numbers that people's eyes tend to glaze over. But actually, the numbers are really, really important. And let's just walk back a little bit. I mean, you mentioned, and you politely didn't mention my gray hair, but you mentioned that I've been writing about this stuff for a long time. I remember going to the Copenhagen climate conference in 2009. And I remember sitting in the room as fight after fight ensued. The fights didn't actually produce much in Copenhagen by way of agreement. But one of the big fights on the table 12 years ago in Copenhagen was how much money rich countries were going to pony up to help poor countries or poorer countries pay for the transition to lower carbon stuff. And I guess the point I want to make here is that it is absolutely true, as you said, that pot of money, the $100 billion, has not materialized. But that $100 billion is tiny. Anyone who looks at this says would be necessary to shift the global economy, not just the energy system, but the global economy, onto a path that is sufficiently decarbonized to take emissions from going like this, not just here, but down to here, which is where scientists tell us. And so while at these climate conferences, at least traditionally, the debate has largely been what size checks governments are going to write, what size checks of public money are going to materialize. In fact, what's become really, really clear in the past several years is that public money is important only as a catalyst for private money, because there is no way that governments, even if they came up with a couple $100 billion, are going to come up with the kind of money that's necessary to shift the global energy system and other parts of the global economy onto a decarbonized path. So what governments can do is they can effectively, to steal an economist's term, prime the pump. And they can send signals both with the checks that they write and with the policies that they promulgate. But at the end of the day, the real money is not the $100 billion. It's not the public money. The real money is the private financing, which is why we in the Stanford Climate and Infrastructure Project looked at what we looked at. And And the question is that really big pipeline of money shifting? And the answer is there's a lot of rhetoric that big pipeline of private money is going to start to shift. There are interesting indications that maybe the front of that pipeline the flow of that pipeline is starting to shift, but it really remains to be seen whether the sums are going to shift in a big way. And winning the climate game is all about shifting that private financing and shifting it in the developing world where it matters most.
So what is happening with domestic private financing in the developing world?
Well, it's unclear what's happening because this is all very early days. A number of countries that are really important, a number of developing countries that are particularly important to climate change, and they are important basically for two reasons. Number one, because their emissions are increasing so rapidly enough that they start in the next few years, if they haven't already, to become relevant in terms of a tranche of global emissions, and also relevant because of the amount of money that they're spending on new infrastructure. A lot of these, an increasing number of these countries have made pledges that they are going to decarbonize in significant ways. They're making their own net zero pledges. So rhetorically, that's quite promising. However, the reality on the ground is very, very different. And I'm going to describe a reality on the ground here. And I suspect that you and a lot of the people listening to and watching this are going to say that this sounds not very different from what they understand to be the case in the United States or in Europe or say in Japan, which is that there are strong interests in favor of entrenched systems. I mean, at the end of the day, dealing with climate change is basically about transforming economic systems. And as I said before, I think it's fair to say that dealing with climate change is fundamentally about transforming infrastructure in emerging and developing economies. And therefore, it is fundamentally about transforming the interests at play there. And so what you see on the ground in many of the emerging and developing economies that have the highest carbon intensities and that are continuing to build, say, coal-fired power plants and natural gas-fired power plants, particularly coal-fired power plants, is that they can do the math just like anyone on the climate pod can do the math. And they see that measured a certain way, solar and wind are cheaper to build than gas or coal. Now, that math is very complicated, and there are a lot of asterisks to that, but they can see the math just like anyone else can. The point is, this is not just a matter of classical economics. The reality is that there are important interests in these countries that have made their money with entrenched energy systems, established energy systems, fossil fuel energy systems. And there are, these are not just nefarious companies, these are populations of people who have made their livelihoods mining coal, building coal-fired power plants, everything about the local political economy that depends on high carbon infrastructure. And so shifting that is much more complicated than just saying, right, well, a solar plant costs less to build than a coal-fired power plant, so let's do that. The point is, and this is a pretty important conclusion of our work, that if you accept this analysis that more money is coming from, increasing amounts of money are coming from domestic from the domestic countries, from the countries domestically, they're building this stuff, and that many of those countries want to shift. The question is, how can those countries be helped shifting the economic incentives such that the companies and the regions in those countries that very sensibly regard dirty infrastructure as in their economic interests can see a shift in those economic interests? And at the end of the day, it's got to be more than just subsidies for renewable energy, because that can't last forever.
So how do we do it?
Yeah, how do we do it? That's a good question. Look, I mean, it's going to be really messy. And the answer is, it's not going to be decided from Glasgow or from Washington. This is going to be very much about shifting, here I'll use a wonky term, shifting the political economies in these countries, shifting the power structures in these countries. Now, in broad terms, the dynamics are going to be similar from country to country. The answer is that, again, one has to promulgate policies, shift money that makes whole parts of these countries and companies in these countries that have depended for their livelihoods on dirty stuff. I mean, dirty in a climate sense, things, and pull them along. But what that looks like is going to be very different. And so it's a matter of getting these constituencies around a table and talking about what the realities are locally and how the realities in Vietnam differ from, say, the realities in South Africa, and what is seen as realistic and in each of these countries, and really, really importantly, forcing these governments and the companies and the financiers that are important in the orb of each of these governments, forcing the governments that have made promises recently to decarbonize, to hit net zero by year X, to get very specific soon about how they're going to do that. Because it's one thing, again, as you've talked about before, it's one thing to make promises to reach net zero by mid-century. It's quite another thing to say, we're going to achieve this step in 5 years, and this step in 7 years, and this step in 9 years. And if a country, and again, the whole constellation of economic interests around that government can't do that, then I dare say the promise to reach net zero by 2050 or 2060 isn't worth much. And so again, wonderful that Glasgow achieved agreement on the importance of net zero in a broad sense. And so now the hard work begins, which is homing in on the economies in the developing world that are most important in terms of their carbon trajectories, and figuring out how to shift the incentives in those countries such that decarbonizing is seen by politically really important constituencies as an opportunity rather than just an unmitigated threat.
And the political incentives are so thorny, right? Because it's all you're incentivized as a politician to make those pledges. That's really popular. Enacting them, that's where the pain comes. And there's no political incentive not to just be making long-term pledges that you don't necessarily have to face voters to be accountable for.
Well, that's a really interesting point. I think I'd agree with you that there's no disincentive to make long-term pledges if your constituency, if your voters will allow you to do nothing but make long-term pledges. But I think people are getting smart pretty quickly on this. And if you sort of read the global political tea leaves on climate change, there's an increasing demand for governments and companies, everyone who's making these gauzy sounding mid-century net zero pledges, to get more specific and to get nearer term. And so I think actually national governments and companies, which is to say presidents and senators and Congress people and CEOs who are making these pledges and think they're just going to be able to sort of sit pretty and say, I'm going to do this in 50 years, by which point, by the way, I'll no longer be in office, or I'll probably be dead. And the next person will have to deal with it, or the person after that. I think that's actually probably a pretty myopic view. And I think what you're starting to see around the world is really important, politically important constituencies saying, quite soon, you have to tell us what you're going to do. And so I suspect that the CEOs or the government officials who thought that they could kind of sit pretty for a long time just by making the promises are going to have a comeuppance pretty soon. And I also think it's probably overly simplistic to think that they thought that they'd be able to get away with that, or at least that a lot of them thought that they could get away with it. I mean, there is a whole industry now around the world of very highly paid consultants and lawyers and bankers, people not in Birkenstocks, but in very well-cut suits, who are getting paid a lot of money to help these institutions, governmental and private, figure out how to do this. It is very, very unclear from what has been said so far whether they're going to be able to do it, and if they are, how they're going to be able to do it. And I think that's the imperative, is to push for the kind of disclosure that will allow regular people to assess that. But the demands are starting to shift in that direction. And I think that's why this kind of work is important.
Oh, it's incredibly important. And the study covers 2018, 2019, and 2020. I'm very curious to see what shakes out as a result of all of the energy news that we've seen in 2021, right? If you look at the front, but just here in the United States, if we look at the front pages of a lot of newspaper, the focus on energy isn't always going to be climate. Like, we're hearing a lot about gas prices and new infrastructure being built out in just the United States alone. What would you want to look for or study when it comes to what is going to happen in 2021 and how that might impact new power infrastructure in the developing world?
Well, one thing is what I was alluding to before, which is I think that the promises have to get a lot more granular very quickly. Because from those promises flow all sorts of investment decisions. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In the last several months, the leaders of, I mentioned Joe Biden in the United States, the leaders of South Korea and of Japan have essentially said they're going to phase out financing of coal-fired power plants in other countries, their financing of coal-fired power plants in other countries. Now, one thing to watch for there is the lobbying that goes on within each of those countries by the structure of industries that have built up significant profits over the years, building those high carbon infrastructure projects in the developing world. And so if you start to see, well, if you see quiet by those companies, you might be reasonable in suspecting there's actually not a lot of air there. If you see real pushback, then you might sense that in fact the companies themselves think that these promises are real. So I think a good thing to watch for is the domestic political fights in the industrialized countries that are pledging to clean up their acts in developing countries. Similarly, watch for political fights in the emerging and developing economies. To the extent that interests in those countries that have built up dirty infrastructure over the years start to get very concerned about the veracity, that is, start to think that the government officials who are pledging to clean up infrastructure in those countries are serious. Those companies are likely to push back, and these are the growing pains. These are the cries of the transformation. So again, this is all going to be really messy, but I think at the end of the day, everything that we're talking about is a grand story of the transformation of global capitalism. Decarbonization, if it happens, will be a massive, unprecedented transformation of global capitalism. And what you're going to start to see are the interests shift, the winners and losers shift. You're already starting to see that. And I think to the extent that we all see an intensification of that, a shifting of the winners and losers, that will be a sign that these net zero promises are serious. If all we see are a bunch of big global organizations with members patting themselves on the back for having made wonderfully rosy promises, I don't think what you're seeing is a global transformation.
Let me ask a really dumb question. Where is the financing come? Like, what kinds of companies are financing these projects in the developing world? We talking banks, utilities, private companies? Like, where does it come from?
Yeah, it's a really good question. All of the above. Certainly banks, and there are lots of different kinds of banks, but certainly banks. You mentioned utilities, certainly utilities. And there's another group of companies that are in the business of building stuff, building big stuff. And these are the, global versions of General Electric, those sorts of companies. So these are the companies that build power plants, say, in the context of power plants. All of these companies have interest. But then there are all sorts of other companies. I mean, there are private equity firms. There basically anyone who is in the business of investing in a project has an interest here. And we can get much more specific here. I mean, there are different kinds of investments. So there's debt and there's equity. Certain kinds of investors want to loan money to a project, money that has to be repaid, that's debt. Certain kinds of investors want to invest in a project, that is, own a chunk of that project. And to the extent that the value of the project rises, their investment rises as well. So there are all sorts of players here. And in fact, the cast of characters of these players is actually widening, which is really fascinating. So who would have thunk that Google or Amazon was going to be in the business of infrastructure finance? But it turns out that tech companies increasingly are spending money in developing countries with an eye toward getting cleaner power, because they've promised the world that they are going to clean up their carbon footprints. So it's a mass. I mean, essentially, every sort of player you can imagine investing in the global economy is investing in these countries, in infrastructure in these countries. But I just want to make one point, which is that not all of those investors are created equal. Not all of those financiers are equal. And so one way to discern who is most important, right? Let's just pull back again. At the end of the day, if we're talking about kind of the mother of all global problems in climate change, but one has to attack this strategically. And so one way to attack this strategically is to think about the countries that matter most in terms of their emissions trajectories, which is why the developing world and certain developing countries are so important. But then one also, if you're following the money to figure out how to shift investment, you want to think about which financiers are the most important. And so what you see is that there are a relatively smaller number of financiers who are investing massive sums in infrastructure in emerging and developing economies. And it's not just a matter of the number of dollars that those institutions are investing, although that's important. It's also the kind of money that they're investing. And so without getting too deep in the weeds here, investing institutions tend to work together in consortia. They tend to go work in packs, and they have very specific roles in these packs. And so a certain institution can have an outsized importance, not just in terms of how much money it's investing, but in terms of where in the consortium, when in time it is investing. And so really understanding these details, the details of who's investing in these projects and in what consortia is important, because it leads you to the institutions that are most important to change. And I'll just say that one of the, we think, most important results of the work that we've done is a data tool that allows one actually to assess, to compare the portfolios of different financing institutions, Bank A versus Bank B, and assess the carbon intensity of Bank A's portfolio in developing country X versus Bank B's portfolio in developing country X, but also to assess Bank A's portfolio in one country versus the same bank's portfolio in another country. So this allows you to sort of dial in a very granular way on this flow of money. And that's the kind of granularity that one really needs to do to understand what the shifts are that you need to make a difference in carbon emissions.
There's been a lot of discussion this year. We talked about this on the show quite a bit about what needs to, like, what kind of financial reporting we
Uh-huh.
need on carbon emissions to understand kind of where we're at. What kind of gaps did you see in your data that you'd like to see more reporting on so that you can have more studies like this that go into the details we need to understand the problem?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And I would just say that, look, I mean, to my mind, the value of a study like this is not just an academic study sitting on a shelf. I certainly hope not. There was a lot of effort that went into this. But I mean, the kind of analysis is really important for policymakers to undertake, for investors to undertake. What kind of gaps? Let me just be very humble here and say that I've talked here about what I think is an interesting study that goes beyond what others have done. There are real holes in our data, just like there are real holes in most data in this area, and the holes in that data are really instructive. So, what are they and why are they there? I'll give you a couple of examples of what are they. The data set that we used for this comes from two data bases that were collected by the World Bank. And those databases each contain information on specific projects, infrastructure projects in the developing world. We found certain projects that were not in those databases. And I'm sure that there are projects that we did not find that are not in our data set. So, I mean, we think that number is relatively small, but one kind of hole is that there are infrastructure projects that are just not included. I mean, more are popping up all the time. Another kind of hole is even for infrastructure projects that we have that we can see something of the financial flow on, we can't see all of the financial flow. There are certain investors that have not reported their involvement. And it turns out that investors from certain countries tend to report their involvement less. And one of those countries is China. China is obviously a hugely important country, both in terms of its own emissions and in terms of the emissions it's financing, the high emission and the low emission projects it's financing around the world. But to the extent that financing institutions are not reporting what they're doing, we can't see it. Now, that brings us to a really important recommendation here, which is it is really important for policymakers to force disclosure. And disclosure can be forced by peer pressure, that is essentially naming names of entities that are disclosing and of those that are not. And it can be done through actual mandates. There's a huge effort underway in the world to increase disclosure. This is an effort by central banks around the world, by stock exchanges around the world. But this is still really early days in this effort. And we made the recommendation while the Glasgow Climate Conference was going on, and apparently no one listened to us. But the recommendation that policymakers in Glasgow make a real push to mandate better disclosure. I mean, that sounds like a really wonky recommendation, but it's really important. It's hard to see how the world gets clarity, that the clarity that it needs on any of these big, broad policy efforts around climate change if we don't know who's putting money where. And we just need way better insight into that.
At the start of the conversation, you said that if we don't meet, or if we don't decarbonize, or we don't figure out the infrastructure issue in the developing world, the climate game is over. And to be specific here, we are not going to hit 1.5 or stay at 1.5 if we do not solve this problem.
That's right. I mean, so let me be very specific about this. I mean, what we did in this study is look at projects. So just to back up a second, we have this database. This database has projects, infrastructure projects all around the developing world, and the World Bank estimates that these data sets together include about 80% of infrastructure projects in the developing world. So not at all 100%, but pretty comprehensive. And we found that if you look at we looked specifically at power plants, partially because electricity is really relevant to climate change, obviously, but partially because to the extent that we developed a methodology to assess the carbon intensity of power plants, our expectation was that we could take that methodology and apply it to other kinds of climate relevant infrastructure, such as, say, transportation, which we hope to do. But let's just get back to your point. So it turns out that of the power plant, of the generation, the electricity generation, which our data set shows to have gotten financing approval between 2018 and 2020, 52% of that generation is too carbon intensive to be consistent with the goal of keeping the rise in Earth's average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Just over half is too carbon intensive. And again, that is in the years 2018, 19, and 20, the 3 years immediately prior to the world getting religion on climate change as measured by these net zero promises. So one would think that if these net zero promises were real, that the governments and companies making them would have had to have been thinking about them a year or two or three before. And yet, what we find is that more than half of the power plant infrastructure in the part of the world that matters most, the developing world, that was built in the 3 years prior to this spate of announcements was too dirty. And so that gives one real reason for pause. It may not come as a huge surprise because if you look at lots of other studies are sounding the alarm and saying we the world are way off base. But it's particularly important to look at where the money's going, and the bottom line is that the money's not going into the right place right now.
Is there hope, or are we out of time?
Well, we are running out of time. I think I'm going to answer this the way a lot of guests on your podcast answer this question. We are running out of time. I'm not a climate scientist, but I read a lot of them, and they tell us that we have about 10 years. And if you look at where the money is moving, indeed, the money is moving in a cleaner direction, but it is not moving quickly enough in a sufficiently cleaner direction to get us there. So we are running out of time. Is there hope? Yeah, there's hope. And I guess, I mean, there is hope that we do better than we are doing. My kids ask me this question a lot, is there hope? And I was talking to someone recently who made a point that I think is important maybe to emphasize here, which is that despite the focus on 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, and I am not going to be the one to tell you that those are not important measures, because incredibly intelligent climate scientists tell us that they are important measures. But let's be clear that all of the indicators suggest that we are blowing past those metrics. And I guess the point I want to make is that even if we do blow past those climate metrics, that doesn't mean we should stop, because every bit we reduce is a good bit to reduce. Now, again, I want to be very clear. I'm not an apologist here, and I'm not suggesting that we can slow down the effort. I'm suggesting quite the contrary. But I am suggesting that when we think about whether there's hope, and I think actually there's a lot of consternation about this around the world, we need to be less binary than 1.5 degrees yes or no, or 2 degrees yes or no. And the point is that it is a real slog to get this work done, a real slog as evidenced by 35 minutes of discussion you and I have just had about the intricacies of global finance. But if you're still with us after 35 minutes of this discussion, then you care enough to understand that nuance is important, and that pushing investment in a cleaner direction, every bit of that is important. And I'll just say one last thing on this, which is that, there are what have come to be known as tipping points. There are tipping points in the science, but there are also tipping points in the money. And I think we are living in the middle of something of a tipping point financially. There is a kind of critical mass of money that is moving toward cleaner endeavors in the developing world. These net zero promises are extraordinary, even though many of them at this point are just rhetoric. If you had said a year ago that the number of companies and governments promising net zero would be what it is, I think most people would have told you were nuts. And the point is that enough of them have said it that essentially every other one has felt that it has to do it or say it too. So now the question is, will they do it? They've said it, will they do it? But the fact that they've said it and that they're now feeling pressure to do it is a significant shift. And so now the hard work is to assess the extent to which they're doing it. This is where the disclosure bit comes in. And then to muster the factual analysis to help clarify a pathway to the extent that they're not doing it. That's the whole point of this research. And so, look, we're not moving fast enough, but yes, there's hope. If I didn't think there was hope, I wouldn't be spending my days this way.
That would be podcasting. But to bring it back to the study, as you know in the study, there's an extraordinary amount of infrastructure that will still need to be built, that will still need to be financed in the developing world. There is still so much still at play.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's right. A massive quantity of infrastructure that will determine what temperature trajectories or what temperature thresholds the world meets has yet to be built. So these decisions are live. And yeah, I mean, absolutely it matters. I mean, I think the question that you were asking before is so much warming baked in that even if what's built from here on out is really great, it doesn't matter. And the point is, a lot of warming is baked in, but absolutely massive quantities of infrastructure have yet to be not just built, but financed. And so to the extent that the people financing this stuff are making different decisions, it matters.
You and I are actually running out of time, but before I let you go in this interview, I want to just hear a little bit about your career. You've had a fascinating career. How did you get into all of this?
I graduated from college and became a newspaper reporter, and I spent the first 20 years of my adult life as a daily newspaper reporter. I spent most of that time, the biggest chunk of that time. And I had different beats at the Journal, including for a time the automotive industry and for a time the oil industry, and then more broadly, the energy industry. And it was in the context of writing about the auto industry from Detroit and the energy industry from Texas that I became really interested in what at the time was this just developing concept called climate change. And I was interested in it less as a scientific issue and less as a political issue and more as a financial issue. It became really evident to me that that to the extent that the world dealt with climate change, it was going to require a massive shift in money. And again, that was going to mean a big reshuffling of the global capitalism decks. There were going to be massive new groups of economic winners, massive new groups of economic losers. And to me, that was just a fascinating story. I remember, I think it was in 2002, I was lucky enough to have the Journal send me to Johannesburg, South Africa, to a conference, a global conference on what was then the weird sounding term sustainability. And it was actually, maybe it was a few years later, but it was right around the time that Europe was promulgating the first carbon trading system. And I remember sitting in the hotel bar at this very nice hotel in Johannesburg and seeing they were almost all men in very well-tailored suits, talking in largely European accented English about climate change. And I remember thinking, that's really interesting. I bet these guys didn't kind of cut their careers on climate change. And what was happening was they were well-heeled representatives of multinational corporations that were about to get hit with regulations on carbon emissions. And they were trying to figure out how to mitigate not the effect on the world, but the effect on their company's bottom lines. And so anyway, fast forward from that, that was sort of an aha moment for me where I realized this is just a fascinating story. So I spent a lot of time at the Journal writing about the effect of the effort to deal with climate change on companies across industries. And then about 10 years ago, I made a jump to Stanford when a center had been created at Stanford dealing with energy policy and finance, and it's been really fascinating. I've spent a lot of time in China, at least before COVID, a number of trips per year, looking into China's really important role in all of this. I continue to write journalistically as well as academically, but at the end of the day, what's fascinating to me is assessing the movement of money around climate change and whether that movement of money is sufficient not just to create economic winners and losers, but actually to deal with climate change. And on that question, the jury's still out.
Well, I tell you, I'm going to link to the study in the show notes. People should definitely read the study and also to your website because it shows a lot of the great writing you've done. Jeffrey Ball, it's so great to talk to you. This has been a fascinating conversation, and again, it's a fascinating fascinating study. Where else should people go online to follow your work?
Well, they can go to the study. They can go to my website, which you kindly mentioned. They can go to the website of the center at Stanford where I work, which is called the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance. I think those are good places.
Phenomenal. Well, Jeffrey Ball, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Thanks very much for having me.